I'm not recreating a scene from Silksong so I can steal it for my own game. I'm going so I can learn from people who actually know what they're doing. At the very least, I'll try to catch the basic principles behind how game visuals are built. Hi everyone, Lisa here. And what you're seeing on screen is the beginning of the process of creating one tiny little scene from Silksong. I'm going to walk you through the entire pipeline of making a 2D side view game scene. I'm pretty sure this is going to be both useful and interesting. Let's go. As you can see, I'm starting by blocking out the raw shape of the future scene using black squares. More than anything, it feels like drawing. I'm using the map from scriptesword.com as a reference. In real projects, of course, you'll be guided by your character's abilities and by the level design concept. The outline is ready. It's not perfectly accurate, but right now, the most important thing is to capture the feeling. Now we're drawing the first assets. It looks like the platforms have a top part, a bottom part, and a central element. And they all seem kind of similar across different platforms, but at the same time, they're small and fragmented. You can tell by these little knots that look repeated. It seems like that's being used here is a set of elements, rather than one seamless texture, but you can never be sure about it. These little stick-like elements are blued by roughly the same amount, but they behave slightly differently relative to the camera. I drew these little base pieces. The platform will be split into a top part, a bottom part, and an edge. For both the top and bottom edge, though, I'm going to use the same piece. I make these base pieces seamless, and then later I cut out the edges separately so the side part doesn't look chopped off. By seamless, I mean the beginning and the end of the image are perfect continuations for each other. So if you place this sprite next to its own copy, you won't see the seam. I also drawing the platform support element, and I'm making this seamless too. Now let's move into Unity and just start slapping these elements onto the platforms by simple duplication. Now comes the hardest part. We need to hide the fact that it is the same asset reused across all the platforms. Let me make a small detour here. In reality, most players do not care at all that his seams are visible, or that there are little imperfections or repeated patterns. What players notice first are the environment details, the animations, and the interactive objects, not the material of the floor or the ceiling. In some types of games, you can even leave it all as is. Just make the surface details on the platforms less distinctive, but we'll still try to smooth out as much repetition as possible. I'm already starting to add the platform edges, which of course also gives each platform more uniqueness. But let's take a look at a few more options. One option is to mirror parts of the platforms. We have two unique parts, remembering that the top and bottom are the same asset, which gives us 4 unique combinations. The next option is to bring different layers to the front. In our particular case, pushing the middle logs backward changes the look quite a lot. There are a few final combinations this way, but the result itself looks great. And another option, offset the tiles along the axis so that each platform simply starts from a different point of the same seamless layer. To me, this option has the biggest potential, but Unity doesn't provide it out of the box. So to make it work, you'll have to write your own shader or script. And the last thing I want to mention is a tiny trick. It doesn't change the overall impression, but it helps add a bit more life, that is, changing the tone of the finished objects. In this case, the closer objects are darker, so you can try darkening them a bit more in the editor. This is what I ended up with. In my opinion, it all looks pretty organic and the presence of the seamless layer doesn't really stand out. After that, I simply added some decorative beams, and with that, the work of the platforms was done. The next step is to add foreground details onto the platforms. First thing that jumps out is that even the elements which are obviously very close to the camera by their Z position are deliberately made blurry and washed out. This is especially obvious in the fences of the platform. If they had been placed further away, they would either show up underneath the platform or noticeably stick out above it. But here you can tell they're actually very close. To add some variety, there are also extra details here. I drew a spool, a fence, a hanging bow, both lying around, and little racks. Later, I'll add a metal deck to the platforms, hooks, and light bulbs. I duplicate all these elements and then blurred and whitened them. At this stage, we need to choose the base tone of the background. Mine is light pink, while in the original it's more yellow-green. From this point on, the further an element is from the camera, the more of that background tint is going to show through. Let's go into Unity. There are no tricks, unfortunately. We just place everything in the scene and move the elements slightly behind the platform. In terms of Z position, that will be somewhere around 001 to 002. And this is the look we get. The moment you add these tiny macro details, the scene instantly comes alive. Now let's move on to the walls of our scene. The walls are interesting too. It feels like they are also made not from one solid texture, but from separate sprites. It looks like on the left, they often simply duplicated those same elements, just at a slightly different angle, and shifted a bit further back on the Z-axis. That creates a sense of volume. Overall, it's pretty much the same here, only while the original had more than one sprite for round and fabric walls. I'm making just one of each. I leave the fabric wall as a regular sprite, but make the round wall seamless. Now we add the walls to the scene. Then I drew an interactive object, a wheel with sharp spikes. This is what the wheel looks like as an asset, and this is what it looks like in the scene. You can tell that I drew the wheel details separately. That helps diversify the look a bit, but you should keep in mind that if you're going to have a lot of these wheels, it's better to just draw all the details right away and not overcomplicate things with variety. Now let's pay attention to the edges of our scene. The first thing you can do is simply hide everything the player isn't supposed to see using the camera frame. In the Cinemachine package, there is a component called Confiner. I set up the polygons and this is the result. In some cases that will be enough. You won't need to darken anything or black out the edges of the visible area. But in Hollow Knight, besides the confinement, they also very often use the darkening trick. The foreground is drawn almost completely black. At the same time, it's set as a separate layer, so it doesn't move in sync with the main part. There's a kind of overlap or drift, but at the same time you can tell that in some places the overlap is there and in some places it isn't. So let's add it too. To create this effect, we'll need black shapes of different forms with soft edges. We'll use them to build the foreground. We also need silhouettes representing nearby objects. In our case, gears and beams. I place them in the scene a little closer to the camera, so that we get a parallax effect. And this is how it looks. Honestly, down here I'd personally rather not see the black border, while at the top it would actually be very helpful, but for now let's leave that aside and add more depth to the scene. I'm adding the main background elements, first and foremost an extra wall layer, gears and millstones. To add blurred walls without too much effort, we'll just modify the assets we already have in the editor. The fabric wall is simple enough. Apply blur and the background color. But if you want to blur finished seamless layers, it takes a little more effort. If you're using Photoshop, here's how we do it. Create a smart object the size of a layer. This is necessary to preserve a correct cropping. Inside it, create another smart object, and that one is for getting the blur right. Go into it and expand the working area. Add copies of the seamless layer along the edges, and now you can blur it all. Save it, go back to the first smart objects and expanded boundaries on the side opposite the seam, because blur makes the original sprite wider, and that gives you your blurred seamless sprite. Why can't you just apply blur to the sprite the normal way? Because our object is seamless, and the regular blur will break the seamlessness. Let me show you a visual example. This is what happens if you do it the normal way, and this is what happens if you take the future edges into account. After finishing the asset work, we'll go back to Unity and add our walls. And don't forget to move each next wall along the Z position. I simply blurred the gears and animated them through Unity's built-in animation. Now let me show you a little trick with the millstones. In the original, they're animated beautifully. Looks hand-animated too. We're not going to do that. We draw the millstone layers, the base, the rotating element, and the shadow on top. When we make the rotating element seamless, unfortunately, you'll have to save it as a separate file, because in the settings you'll need to set wrap mode to repeat and mesh type to full rect. Then we make a shader using shader graph. Shader graph only works in URP. If your project is in URP, you can ask an AI to write your shader. In shader graph, I make this little beauty here. Then I create a material and assign it to the moving part of the millstone. After that, I add a randomizer so our three millstone don't all spin the exact same way. And here's the result. You might ask me, does this actually look better than a classic animation? And I'll say, not really better looking and not exactly faster either, but definitely more interesting. But seriously, once you write a shader like this one time, you can use it to animate a lot of things in your game. Now for the final touch touches make the furthest background. By the way, to make things easier on yourself, use different sprite sorting layers for different needs. Split the upcoming work into depth plans. For example, background near the player, indoor background, outdoor backgrounds, and so on. The main thing is to plan it all in advance, so you don't end up like me, slowly watching your audience layer values crawl toward int limits. For the every furthest background, I paint light and shadow, and in general, all those tiny details I can see in the original game. I add bits of light and shadow to both the upper and the lower layers. This gives the image more depth, but be careful, on the foreground you have to use alpha, increasing transparency, and transparent sprites aren't exactly great for performance, so for mobile games try to use fewer of them. The result turned out pretty attractive. In the original, you can feel that more effort went into it, and in my opinion, the layers are coordinated much better color-wise. One more little thing. As you can see, I decided not to make the upper part of the mill. The principle of working is already clear enough without it. But down below, the lack of a floor still bothers me. So, same old routine. I make a seamless floor asset, of course duplicate it, then make a blurred version of it, duplicate it again, and then add spools over it from the left, right, and front. Now it's definitely done. Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Bye bye!